Welcome to Upahamu Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the African continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, one of your hosts, and I'm here with my co-host, Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kim, and hello to our listeners. So this week we feature a really urgent and informative conversation that I had with Nisrin Elamin, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. Her work investigates the connections between land, race, belonging, and empire making in Sudan and the broader Sahel region. And she's currently working on a really fantastic and interesting book project based on 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork in central Sudan, which examines the ways landless and landholding communities are negotiating and contesting changes in land ownership prompted by a recent wave of domestic and Gulf Arab corporate investments in Sudanese land. In our conversation, we focus on the conflict in Sudan, the meaning, the causes, and what's happening.
I'm really grateful that you got to chat with Nisrin Elamin last week and that we'll get to share that conversation you had with her. I've been following her work ever since she was a graduate student, actually, and she had co-written a piece with Zachariah Mompili about protests in Sudan, right? Years ago, right before the current conflict broke out, right, where there seemed to be this really incredible popular movement towards democracy. It was just a great piece on why we shouldn't call these protests bread riots, why there was something much more. And I've really just ever since then, it's years ago, I can't even remember what year it was so long ago, published in the Washington Post. But ever since then, I've known her as this voice that we should be listening to because she's an expert on the major political and social issues facing Sudan and Sudanese people. And she's also close to the situation personally, which is a rare combination. I know that you had some follow-up with her after the conversation, and she pointed you to some more resources. Can you share those with our listeners who are interested in knowing more and ways to support those in need?
Absolutely, Kim. And so she pointed us to Radio Dabanga, which is an excellent source of news on Sudan in English, and Sudan Tribune. If people wish to donate to Sudan Solidarity Fund, they can go to the website darfurdiaspora.org. We'll post these links on our show notes. She also mentioned that an important advocacy page is keepeyesonsudan.net. So these are ways in which people can keep informed, but also help the situation in terms of providing aid and support to those who are really very much in need.
Right. So often when we read about conflict in the news, we're thinking about kind of the key players who are making decisions about the movement of security forces or rebels or soldiers, right? Whoever the combatants are. And we forget about people, right? The people who are themselves experiencing conflict firsthand. And so these resources that she shared with us, I think, can give our listeners a chance to think from that perspective, right? The people who are navigating the very difficult and tragic nature of this ongoing conflict. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to bring our listeners' attention to a piece in Foreign Policy written by Clayton Boyenk, a research fellow at the Center of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and Stephanie Schwartz, an assistant professor in international relations at the London School of Economics. Now, the piece is titled, "Tanzania's Threat to Expel Burundians Sets a Dangerous Precedent." In this piece, Boyenk and Schwartz write about how the Tanzanian government has renewed threats to forcibly repatriate more than 100,000 Burundian refugees if they do not return to Burundi voluntarily. In addition to fleeing Burundi multiple times, many Burundians have also been displaced from Tanzania, the state that's provided them refuge. When refugees were forcibly repatriated to Burundi from Tanzania in 2012, many were not welcomed back into their communities. Some found their homes and land occupied after having been gone for decades, and this was a significant obstacle in a tiny country where the majority relies on small-scale agriculture to survive, and so it's a very land-pressured environment in Burundi. Other returnees ended up in something called peace villages, where living conditions were pretty dire. Competition for land often turned violent. And when another crisis came around in 2015, many of these returnees were among the first to flee Tanzania again. Now, Stephanie Schwartz's research has focused on this issue of kind of movement of Burundian refugees and the conflicts surrounding land. And I would point our listeners in particular to her 2019 research article in International Security titled Home Again, Refugee Return and Post-Conflict Violence in Burundi. And again, we'll link this study in the show notes as well. In that study, Schwartz found return migration creates new identity divisions based on whether and where individuals were displaced during wartime. So these divisions, right, whether you were a Burundian who left for Tanzania or a Burundian who stayed, right, these identity divisions became new sources of conflict when local institutions such as land codes, citizenship regimes, or language laws yield different outcomes for individuals based on where they lived during the war. Now, for that article, Stephanie collected ethnographic evidence in Burundi and Tanzania from 2014 to 2016, and that data shows how the return of refugees created violent rivalries between Burundian returnees and the people who didn't leave Burundi. Consequently, when Burundi faced this national level political crisis in 2015, the prior experiences of return shape both the character and timing of outmigration from Burundi. And so that research that Schwartz did is essential for understanding why this latest move by the Tanzanian government matters. She found then, and she cautions us now, that reverse population movements can shape future conflict. And this is why breaking the cycle of forced repatriation, right, this cycle of return and repeat displacement is essential to preventing conflict in the future.
Kim, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I mean, we definitely kind of have the sense of how this happens across space and time. And so it's really useful for us to see this historical example and to be able to trace the consequences of such forced repatriation as in real time these policies are being debated once again. I also wanted to provide our listeners a quick update on the elections in Madagascar that we chatted about last week, and we gave kind of the context of the opposition and the incumbent president, President Rajoelina, who is running for a third term. So the elections were held this week for president. Just voting closed out on Thursday. And in this case, as we mentioned, the opposition candidate did encourage a boycott after weeks of violent protests in the run-up to polling day. And in particular, the boycott was issued in part because of the contention that the Electoral Commission needed to be changed, and that a special court should be set up to hear vote disputes, and that the vote itself should be postponed because of irregularities and concern over the eligibility of the incumbent president in this third term. So the opposition had their set of concerns, and then ultimately, since those concerns were not heeded after following weeks of marches and protests, the opposition called for a boycott. And indeed, that's what the voting turnout looked like. The election itself unfolded peacefully because most people stayed away from the polls. There was low key security presence across the capital, but the general election was marked by low turnout. So there were some lines in areas that were strongholds for the current president, Rajoelina, and that looks like it was about 30% voter turnout in those stronghold areas for the incumbent, whereas just about 15% in opposition strongholds. So this really is quite low turnout, signaling broader public disdain towards the vote and the process and the kind of set of options and choices that they've been given. Rajoelina himself dismissed these calls for delay as a political tactic and warned opponents that trying to prevent people from voting was unlawful. The vote was held. And while we don't yet have final results from the Electoral Commission, we can estimate from this generally very low turnout that the results will be overwhelmingly in the president's favor.
Right. And so he's allowed to seek a third term? This isn't extra constitutional for him to do.
Right. So there are these debates over the constitutionality of such a term, but because of the breaks in his former period, he's making the claim along with the courts that he's eligible. This is like the tactic that we've seen across many different incumbents who use either constitutional changes or breaks within their ruling, their regime, their rule, to be able to contest again, according to maybe the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit.
Spirit of it. Yeah, that's interesting, right? It's amazing to me, men who lose, the audacity they have, right? To be like, oh, well, actually, I'm pretty awesome at this. And even though I lost,
I
recently,
should have another go.
Yeah. So, okay, that's we'll continue to follow what happens, and we'll see, what exactly how many people turn out to vote and what the final count looks like.
Exactly.
And until we have that, let's have a listen to Rachel's conversation with Nisrin Elamin.
All right. Welcome, Nisrin Elamin. We are so pleased to have you here on the podcast and with us here at Cornell University. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm particularly glad that we can have this conversation because we would love for you to explain to our listeners a little bit about what's happening in Sudan, to put into context the conflict that we are not necessarily reading enough about in the newspapers and hearing about through the media. So can you tell our listeners kind of how you would describe what's happening now and how you might root it in longer histories of Sudan?
Yes, thank you. So, I would describe the current war as a power struggle between kind of two factions of the military coup regime. There was a coup in October of 2021. And in April of this year, essentially the Rapid Support Forces, which is a state-sanctioned militia, and the Sudanese armed forces, started fighting in the capital, Khartoum, and vying really for economic and political power of the country as we were coming closer to, a potential sort of tilting during the transitional period of power towards civilians. And so part of how people explain what triggered this is that there was an agreement in December of 2022 that essentially outlined how the army was going to integrate the Rapid Support Forces into its ranks. And also the agreement also had some provisions around military elites handing over or giving civilian oversight over companies that they were owning. So just for your listeners to know, about 80% of Sudan's economy is controlled by military elites. On the one side, you have the gold trade that is mostly controlled by the Rapid Support Forces. And on the other hand, you have about 200 companies controlled by elites within the army, construction, rubber, wheat, and other commodities. And so there was a kind of push during the transition to really have those companies be, overseen by civilians. So I think those two things triggered it. There's much larger kind of underlying issues that caused this war, and I would describe it as a long war that really started in 1955, right, with the beginning of the South Sudanese War. We could even trace it further back to the 19th century, but I think that's how I would describe it. And I wanted to maybe read a short excerpt from something that I wrote recently to kind of just historically situate this. So Sudan's December Revolution, which started in 2018, is often compared to Sudan's 1964 revolution, sparked by clashes between students and police at the University of Khartoum before mushrooming into a kind of broader movement that toppled Aboud's military regime, or to the 1985 revolution triggered by price hikes that toppled Jafar Numeri's regime. But I would like to trace its genealogy back to the 1950s. And I'll begin at independence. Britain's parting gift to Sudan at independence in 1956 was an economy dependent on the extraction of cash crops like cotton and on the exploitation of farmers and landless workers, and a political system which was constructed to serve the interests of a riverain central Sudanese elite at the expense of the South and other peripheral regions, but also of a rural population that sustained this extractive, export-oriented economy. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state unsurprisingly came from tenant farmers who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as world cotton prices plummeted. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosi shortly after independence, and the state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot on the fields or suffocated in detention cells. Elders in my family are still haunted by the tragedy of farmers suffocating in overcrowded, kind of poorly ventilated cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation and regional autonomy, and the central government who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. This 1956 massacre is linked to the Civil War because striking farmers were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against Southern rebels. And I think this moment is important because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that serves elite interests by any means necessary. And in more recent decades, certainly under the al-Bashir regime, we saw this manifest itself in the form of an ethno-nationalist, monocultural Islamist project being imposed on a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious country in violent ways. And we saw this play itself out in Darfur, where a state-sanctioned campaign of unimaginable violence led by the Janjaweed, now known as the Rapid Support Forces, was carried out beginning in 2003. And during this genocide, hundreds of thousands were killed, entire villages were wiped out, millions were displaced. And while this campaign went through various phases, this violence never really ended. It fell out of the headlines, but it never ended, it expanded. And the long war essentially came to the capital on April 15th. And so we see this play itself out now with, as I mentioned, various military actors and factions vying not only for political, but also economic control of the country. And so while it started as a power struggle in April, it has expanded in ways that are really concerning. At the moment, I think many of us are worried that we're seeing the RSF gain ground in the western part of Sudan, Darfur, but also other areas, and essentially pushing the army out. And really, we're seeing very similar violence that we saw in 2003. And then you see the army in other parts of the country. They're still fighting in central Sudan, especially around Khartoum. But there are, Port Sudan and the eastern parts, kind of central and northern parts of Sudan. You see the army have, remain in control. And so there's a fear that we might see a kind of splintering of the state, right? That began with South Sudan seceding in 2011, in part because we haven't really dealt with the roots of this violence in Sudan.
Exactly. Yeah. And then when you say that the RSF, the kind of violence that that is happening harkens back to 2003. Does that mean, in the sense, a kind of targeting? How would you describe the ways in which the violence is affecting civilians? How is it affecting, kind of everyday life in Sudan, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was in Khartoum in April and the war broke out, I had never seen something like this in Khartoum, right? We were surrounded by bombs, missiles, explosions. The RSF was mostly on the ground, while the Sudanese armed forces were kind of controlling the airspace, right? And it was fairly random in a sense. I mean, they were fighting each other in the capital, targeting, important kind of infrastructures of power, if you will. And of course, Sudan, I mean, Khartoum is a city of millions. I think it's about 7 to 9 million, depending on how you calculate it, because it's made up of kind of 3 sister cities. And so it's a very densely populated capital city, and we're all caught in this violence. Now, when the violence started in Darfur, I should say it even in March, before the war started, there was continuing to be violence in Darfur. But when this kind of phase of the war came to Darfur, it took on a different form. As bad as it was in Khartoum, we saw in Darfur, in particular in the western city of El Geneina, much more targeted killings that were, targeting particular ethnic groups, the Masalit in particular. There was one day, I think it was in June, where 1,000 people were killed. And of course, there are no bodies that are officially able to kind of gather data on this, but what we know is that El Geneina has essentially been cleansed, if you will. People have had to flee to Chad, and on the journey have also been targeted. And so it really harkens back to what happened in 2003. And the origins of that, I think, are also not often enough talked about. Which is that you had these Arab-identified ethnic groups from which the RSF draws many of its kind of recruits, who come from these kind of Arab-identified pastoralist groups, who for centuries had been moving across the landscape of Darfur, but with desertification, there was kind of increasing conflict over land, right, with more sedentary kind of farming communities. Including the Thor and the Masalit, who are African identified. And part of what happened in 2003 is that the Sudanese government, instead of de-escalating these conflicts, ended up, arming the pastoralists, and who then became the Janjaweed, to attack these communities. And we've had for decades, if not centuries, traditional methods of resolving conflicts, where a third party would come in and peace agreements would be signed, and conflicts were resolved. And so what this did is it really undermined those systems that had been in place for so long. And so I think this is part of what I look at now in my work, at the way that pastoralists, because of agribusiness and kind of other corporate Gulf investments, etc., continue to be marginalized, and as a result become vulnerable to recruitment by groups like the RSF. And that is not at all, of course, to excuse any of this violence, but to explain that in order for us to not keep going back to this never again violence, right, we have to address the root causes, which include, addressing the grievances of marginalized groups across the country.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, I think what has happened in Jenin and what is now happening in other parts of Darfur, the same thing that happened in Jenin just last week happened, in the last couple of days, happened in other parts of Darfur. And it is horrific. I mean, I have a close friend who was in Niala until quite recently, and she said she had not experienced this kind of violence before, even though she lived through the 2003 genocide. And so I think that, to me, gave me a lot of pause to think about how is it that we are living once again through something like this. And for the most part, the world has remained silent. And it's not to say that I, for one, I'm not an advocate of international intervention. but I am in the sense of, a military intervention or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But I am in support of the war criminals not being legitimized and propped up through these continued so-called peace talks that are happening in Jeddah, that really provide a green light for this to continue, that legitimize the war rather than allow us as Sudanese, should have happened a long time ago, to bring the perpetrators of the violence that happened in 2003. I mean, Al-Burhan and Hemeti as the head of the RSF, Al-Burhan, the head of the Sudanese armed forces, are war criminals whose crimes span decades, including in Darfur. And the fact that they continue to be propped up and legitimized as potential reformists, as potential peacemakers, is partly what has gotten us, to be at the stage of that something like this can happen again.
Exactly, that they're the stakeholders, so to speak, who are brought around the table. And so there are so many things here that are really important to kind of dig into. And one is, right, this international role. And while, there's a big scale on the spectrum from international intervention to what we might think of as using international forums for justice, or thinking about the kinds of dialogues and who's involved around peace, to on the other end of the scale, just like mere awareness of what's happening, concern, right, knowledge. So what do you think, given that, it seems as though the kind of conversation around Sudan is at the global level really off the map because of many other tragedies and atrocities, but also, even maybe for other reasons as well. So how would you situate that in terms of the role of the international and some of the vacuum around knowledge or engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think maybe one thing I'll start with, because we haven't talked about it yet, is the humanitarian situation. So, recently the UN issued a report that stated that we are currently the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, with over 7.1 million people displaced. And that includes some who were displaced before the war. And some people estimate that it's actually closer to 10 million. It's obviously hard in this context to gather data with very few international organizations on the ground. We have 19 million children that are out of school. The vast majority of hospitals in the areas that are affected by this war are not operating anymore. I have relatives who remain in and around Khartoum who are diabetic, for example, who cannot access medication. There are people who are dying of malaria because they cannot access medication. About 25 million Sudanese, and we have a population of about 45 million, is at risk of famine, essentially, in a country that was once touted as the breadbasket of the Middle East, right? And so the fact that this, Sudan is one of the sort of largest humanitarian crises, I don't like to use the word crises, but for this particular purpose in the world, and that there's very little attention on it, I think is about several things. I think part of it has to do with the fact that wars in Africa, and particularly in the Horn, are normalized due to anti-Black racism, and it's sort of seen as, this is an internal conflict that has been going on for so long, and it's very complicated, and it's far away from us. When in reality, the political economy of war makes us all complicit, right? If we think about the military companies that are benefiting from this, the corporate interests that are, at stake here. I study Gulf, specifically Emirati and Saudi land investments in Sudan. And over the past 2 decades, under al-Bashir, but also during the transition, Saudis and Emiratis have invested a combined $27 billion in Sudanese land and real estate and infrastructure projects. And, we have to understand the role of Saudi Arabia in Jeddah in the talks and the peace talks that just concluded that did not lead to a ceasefire. as within that context, right, of the Gulf also wanting to maintain its, to protect its investments, to maintain stability over any form of democratic civilian rule. And, we also have to think about the ways that, for example, the European Union in 2014 used the Khartoum process, which was about kind of essentially externalizing the European Union's border to the region between Sudan, Egypt, and Libya, paid the Sudanese government under al-Bashir at the time around $200 million to militarize that border. And al-Bashir used the RSF for that. And so there you saw a kind of beginning of a legitimization of the Janjaweed, right, turning and the kind of expansion of their transnational network. So you saw a kind of, they had already been legitimized prior to that, but actually, especially during the civil war in Yemen, the Saudi coalition used both RSF troops and Sudanese armed forces troops to fight in that war. And again, thereby expanding their transnational networks of support. And so I think part of what happens is that because the US has mostly played a more kind of diplomatic role, in my view, really undermining the more radical elements of the revolution and of who were calling for very clearly for a transition to full civilian rule from the very beginning after al-Bashir was ousted in April of 2019. And we saw during the transitional period, power was always tilted in favor of the military elites, even though civilian elites were kind of brought into the fold. And the United Nations, under kind of, the US, the UK, United Arab Emirates, were essentially, during the transitional period, not only sidelining neighborhood resistance committees, for example, which are these grassroots committees at the neighborhood level that formed really in the kind of Arab Spring 2013 moment. They have their origins traced back even further, but to mobilize people in protest against the state, but we're also filling a kind of vacuum left behind by an essentially absent state to provide services and support to people in their neighborhoods. They were the ones, for example, who led the COVID-19 kind of awareness campaign and so forth, that they had set out revolutionary charters that said no partnership, no legitimacy, and no negotiations with the military elites, both before and after the coup. And were really not taken seriously as political actors, even though there are 8,000 of them across the country. They're hierarchically organized, but quite highly coordinated and and so there were times when, for example, the UNITAM's negotiations team asked them to join the negotiation table. There was one moment I remember when the resistance committees said they would, but only if it was Facebook aired live on Facebook, right, to make that process more transparent. And the negotiations team refused. And so there was a purposeful, I think, marginalization of those more radical elements of the revolution in favor of a process that prioritized stability over popular democracy. But my point is that even though the US, they have their own corporate interests, but the US in Sudan isn't playing as big of a role as the Gulf players, in my view. Russia has also recently entered, not so recently, but has entered the war as well, both the Wagner Group and the Russian state, mostly on the side of the RSF. And so the US's role has been also shaped by its very myopic policy around countering kind of Russian and Chinese influence on the continent, rather than on thinking about what is best for Sudan, right? And so I think part of what's happening that I see on the US left, at least, is that we need to decenter U.S. empire in some ways, and the U.S. in order to better understand the political economy of this war and how we are all implicated in it. In some ways, it's the Gulf states, the allies of the United States, that are shaping U.S. policy towards Sudan. It doesn't really have a policy, if you will. And so, and again, I should say that I am, and this is, my own kind of politics. I feel like this is a moment. The revolution was an opportunity to say hands off Sudan, right? To really have all of these negative forms of international intervention kind of be exposed and removed. We've now come to a point where it's hard to imagine that. And we do need pressure on the warring factions, who are mostly accountable to these external actors who are fueling the war. Egypt, for example, is fueling the war on the Sudanese armed forces side, right? So to have peace talks that don't include the Gulf, the UAE in particular, or Egypt, means that they won't be able to leverage the kind of pressure needed to actually to actually bring about a ceasefire, which is what's needed at the moment. A couple of months ago when I was talking about this, the people that my mentors would say, we need the international community to have a coordinated effort, right, to bring about a ceasefire. And at that time, there were 3 tracks. There was an IGAD peace talk track, there was an Egypt track, and there was the Jeddah track. And that once that ceasefire happens, then we need to kind of step out of the way and let the resistance committees and the kind of civilian actors who have been sidelined in this transition process guide what the next steps are. That process needed to be much more Sudanese-led, more civilian-led, and also led by people in the peripheries that have been impacted by this long war in a way that the center has not. So far, the Sudanese armed forces has signed 27 peace agreements over the last couple of decades. And none of them have led to peace, right? And so peace is really being used as a currency here to legitimize continued state violence. And I think, this is a moment to rethink that model that hasn't worked.
And to rethink it then, both, as you're suggesting, international actors who are fueling the conflict and in some ways legitimizing through those peace deals, and as well as you're mentioning, the role of civil society and domestic actors. And one of the things I wanted to have you tell us a little bit more about is the landscape of what we might call civil society. Sudan certainly has this iconic imagery of the importance of civil society during the revolution, the role of women, youth, etc. But then also, as you're saying, there's so much about organization through the neighborhood groups, the neighborhood resistance committees. And those seem, to my uneducated eye, like very interestingly structured, and in a way that maybe is distinct from what we think of as kind of formalized NGOs and more politicized or institutionalized, internationally linked civil society groups that often maybe become detached from a more grassroots politics, needs, social services. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about this landscape of civil society, how it's structured, and then what role could they have and do they have towards that peace, that really meaningful peace?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very important question, especially because I think in many ways the Sudanese revolution could and has served as a model for what popular democracy and a kind of challenge to elite politics in the region might look like. So, I should start by saying that the Bashir regime, when it came to power in 1989, one of its mandates was to really decimate and kind of undermine trade unions and kind of civil society, the vibrant civil society that in the past had challenged military rule. Most of our life, most of Sudan's, post-colonial life we've been under military rule. And so they're kind of learning from the past. And so through that effort, much of the kind of more, again, radical organizing went underground. The 90s was a particularly brutal era of repression, where people were tortured, imprisoned. Many people went into exile. And we saw a kind of parallel emergence of a kind of civil society that was very much controlled by the state. So NGOs that were really state entities in a way that would be registered through something called the HAK, which is an agency that legitimizes NGOs, etc. But again, parallel to that, you did see the emergence of kind of civil society that in many ways resisted NGOization, right? That so these neighborhood resistance committees, especially over the last decade, also unions. I work in rural parts of Sudan where there are definitely neighborhood resistance committees, but there are also other civil society formations like unions, like this farmers union. It's an independent union that kind of emerged in response to the kind of more government affiliated union to really challenge the government's practice of privatizing and pushing neoliberal reforms in the agricultural sector that forced a lot of small farmers into debt, who then sold their land to state elites as part of their project of attracting Gulf investors, for example. And so you also have in this region of Sudan called the Jazeera, which is kind of like a delta right south of Khartoum, very fertile area of land. Most of the labor performed on those farms 70% of it is performed by landless farm workers, some of whom are displaced from the various regions of Sudan that had been at war. But also you have a community of people who are Sudanese, but originally from northern Nigeria. So they're Hausa, who settled when the British established the Jazeera scheme, kind of recruited. They were on their way to Mecca and stayed. And so they have their own associations that are very much challenging the legal framework that we inherited from the British, that has allowed the state to dispossess people of their land. And so there are, I think, these really vibrant kind of civil society formations. In fact, the period between the ousting of al-Bashir in April of 2019 and the October 2021 coup saw an unprecedented number of civil disobedience kind of organizing, from communities in South Kordofan successfully organizing against mining companies and their use of cyanide and mercury, to the teachers union in Darfur, organizing strikes, port workers in Port Sudan, organizing against the privatization of that port. There have been many people who have been, the Russians, the Turkish government has tried to kind of acquire parts of that port, and so they've organized against that. And so there have been the longest worker strikes in Sudan's history during this period as well. So I think what we really saw during the revolution was a kind of politicization of civil society in a way that not only that sort of defied or resisted NGOization, but also kind of traditional opposition party politics. And so the resistance committees have purposefully not aligned themselves with opposition parties. In fact, they're ideologically, the organizing kind of happens across ideological lines. And the committees are quite different, because there are some in very wealthy neighborhoods in Khartoum, and then there are some in, more rural parts of the country, or, in cities in Darfur, where the political analysis around what needs to happen for Sudan to finally become free, if you will, and fully democratic is different, right? Based on people's relationship to the state and state violence. So I think, what's important for me, for people to understand is that these same resistance committees that were not taken seriously during the transition as political actors are now essentially doing the work of an absent state and of an absent international humanitarian community, right? In the areas that are most kind of hard hit by the war, Khartoum, Darfur, Kordofan, members of resistance committees have organized something called emergency response rooms. They've organized communal kitchens. These response rooms attend to the medical needs of people. They distribute food. People have been converting schools into displacement shelters. And I should say that this is amidst war, right? I mean, there are these volunteers are being targeted, imprisoned, some of them forcibly, people have tried to forcibly recruit some people into either side. And there are some resistance committees that have started siding with the army because of the way this war has evolved. But all that to say that I think that to us should show us that the resistance committees are very capable of guiding what the path forward should look like. I often, as a diaspora person, as a professor at the University of Toronto, get asked, what is the path forward? How do we get out of this mess, right? And I say, part of the problem is that the wrong people get asked that question. Mm-hmm. I, as a person in the diaspora, should not answer that question, right? It needs to come from the people who remain, on the ground, essentially continuing the revolution, right? Mm-hmm. This is a new phase of the revolution. And they're often not taken seriously and asked that question. And so that, to me, I think is where we need to move, is to take the revolutionary charters that they've written seriously. There has been a civilian gathering in Addis Ababa recently, but it's again mostly elites, and the resistance committees have not joined. And that also should give us pause, right? We should be asking what kind of forms need to be established for resistance, and under what conditions, right? Under what terms do they need to be created in order for resistance committees to participate, right? Members of the resistance committees, some of whom are now in exile.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's really important, fascinating how the resistance committees themselves have been organized and what work they're doing under very difficult conditions. One of the other things that you've mentioned that I wanted to just dive into a little bit further is your use of the term kind of Arab identified or African identified communities. I wanted to discuss with you a little bit more about identities.
Sure.
Because I think it's really a key from the outside, or how things are painted, well outside of the context. There have been these tropes or narratives around Arab versus African. And I think part of what's interesting about your work is an effort to trouble or destabilize and redress such markers as Arab and African, which is, I think, much more useful broadly, because then the ways in which these identities then get carried back into particular contexts and mobilized around the next stages of strategy. So I was wondering how you can explain to us the kind of relationship of the country's colonizing history, relationship to different peripheries. How do these identities come to be placed or taken up, and how are they maybe less a thing or solid than we might imagine?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is both a very important and difficult question to answer, especially as someone from Central Sudan. I often hesitate to answer it because I think there is such there's important historical context to this question that is hard to provide in short amount of time. But I mean, I think one of the important things to remember is that, and I'll go now back to the 19th century. during the Ottoman Empire, so I do my research, in Central Sudan, kind of the seat of power, if you will. It's a place where a lot of elites, in government have, come from, both, I would say, the north and the central part of Sudan, where I'm from. And which is why it was significant that I think the revolution crystallized at that moment where even those rural communities were starting to kind of rise up around these kind of neoliberal restructuring of the rural economy and people feeling like their livelihoods were being decimated, but who had not experienced the same kind of state violence that people had been experiencing in the peripheries really since independence, if you will. And so during the Ottoman Empire, the taxation system, and I'm going to sort of, do a very maybe unnuanced take on, rendering of this, but
it will be nuanced for us, for educating everyone. Thank you.
So, during the Ottoman Empire, the taxation system that was imposed on small farmers required them to, or essentially made them go into debt, right? And as a result, they sold their land to local domestic land holding elites. And so we saw during that time a kind of consolidation of land in the hands of, the concentration of land in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And those same people who were dispossessed in that process became slave traders, captured, people in the South, brought them up to this region of the country, who then became workers, enslaved people working on these plantations, essentially. And many of us in Central Sudan, our family lineage, I have people in my family who are of enslaved descent, and the system of slavery did not end until the 1950s. And landlessness and enslaved descent maps onto itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I mention this to say that in the early 2000s, when people in the United States were talking about conflict, genocide, war in Sudan, it was often talked about in these very stark kind of binary terms: African versus Arab, Christian versus Muslim, center versus periphery. And while there is a truth to all of that, it's of course a lot more complex than that. And the center has its own hierarchies and histories of enslavement and racialized and gendered hierarchies, right? In some ways, some of these constructions or some of these categories are constructed for the purpose of maintaining an extractive war economy, of kind of violently maintaining, as I said, this ethno-nationalist, really fascist, genocidal state. And, I often go back to the late John Garang, who's a Southern Sudanese leader, who had a vision for a new Sudan that addressed these kind of root causes and that named the ways that ethnicity and race has been mobilized to the benefit of elites. I don't know if this really answers your question fully, but I think part of me is challenged by the fact that for me as a Central Sudanese, it's important to name that what happened in Darfur in 2003 was a genocide. And that what is happening today is very similar to that. And that in some ways, it never ended. Mm-hmm. It evolved, it took on different forms, but it never ended. What is also important for me to name is that we have not dealt with the root causes of this violence. Mm-hmm. And the revolution attempted to do so. But it was co-opted. Those who were asking for us to really deal with those root causes were marginalized. And so that's, I think, partly why we see history repeating itself. Mm-hmm. Part of what I forgot to mention in the historical context is that after independence, and this is where we can trace some of this back to the British, because I had started with the Ottomans, I want to make sure I include the British here too, is that when the British left in 1956, left is not the right word, but there were 800 administrative seats that were kind of left open, right, for Sudanese elites to fill. Of those 800 seats, 6 went to people in South Sudan, and only 1 to a Darfurian. And the size of Darfur, right? It's about the size of Texas. So that's, I think, partly where things began, right? Is that people have since, in peripheral regions of Sudan, been calling for political representation, forms of regional autonomy and self-determination, but also in part because, without representation in government, the distribution of development funds, the country developed unevenly, right? Starting during colonialism, right, with the kind of focus on the metropole to the port. So when I was in Darfur in 2009, you could feel the ways that, and I was thinking of Walter Rodney, right, of the ways that Darfur was purposefully underdeveloped, right, in terms of infrastructure, education, healthcare, roads, hospitals, etc. And so I think, again, part of what John Garang was articulating in the New Sudan is how we can construct citizenship in a way that everybody is equal, right? And that maps itself onto race and gender and class and so forth. Yeah.
In some ways, that the desire to co-opt or move beyond the revolution for power to reestablish itself in slightly shifted forms, as you say, the underlying currents have not been addressed. And so while the moment that brings us here to talk together is one in which there is this really horrific violence and state led violence from a long period of time. And another way Sudan continues, I think, to give us this hope through the bottom-up demands of the people, which are heterogeneous, right? Which come from different places, different connection to land, different connection to labor, different backgrounds and identities, but these continual, mobilizations of the demand for public services, for peace, for stability, for community, for a revolution, a real democratic future for Sudan. And in that way, I think, what you've shared with us is so important because it sheds light on the structural forces that continue to create these trajectories, but also in many ways a way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, and Ami Tamaklo. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.